going on with your voice?
I've got a call.
Welcome to Hell Island Reports. This episode is a conversation with Kat from the Network for Police Monitoring, NetPol, and gives an overview of the situation for trans and queer protesting in the UK, broader changes in legislation around protest, and whether you really aren't allowed to wear a mask to a protest anymore. Spoilers, you still can, and you still should. This episode does contain some discussion of police violence.
My name's Kat Hobbs, my pronouns are they, them, and I work for the Network for Police Monitoring. We're a small organisation that works around the right to protest and expanding police powers. So we work with individuals, campaign groups and communities that are facing violent and intrusive policing, and we do practical know your rights support. We help link communities with media. We do some campaigning around the right to protest and around police power generally. And we work predominantly with kind of grassroots social movements.
Rad. So
keeps us busy.
Yes, I'm sure it does. So we're recording this on the 26th of March, and on Saturday there was the counter demo to the CAN-SG conference at the Royal College of GPs. There was, like, NetPol put out a statement, LAFA and TAB put out statements about the level of police intimidation and violence at that demo. Mm-hmm. What has, like, NetPol heard about that, and kind of is that out of line or an escalation from other kind of public order, quote-unquote, events?
Yeah, so for people that haven't come across this, on Saturday, as you've said, the Royal College of GPs were hosting a conference on conversion therapy, which is a really abusive psychiatric intervention. And it was hotly challenged, hotly contested by trans rights and solidarity activists and anti-fascists. And what we saw actually from the Metropolitan Police is absolutely, unfortunately, in line with recent ways that they've approached public order situations. So there's a very heavy police presence right from the start of the day. There was very heavy police surveillance, including, worryingly, the deployment of live facial recognition technology. Activists spotted several live facial recognition vans around the site, which were kind of carrying out surveillance of the crowd. And if anyone doesn't know what live facial recognition is, it's a very controversial new technology that doesn't have a lot of legal safeguards around it. So we're quite worried about the way the police are using it. And it uses AI-powered surveillance to compare a live CCTV feed against kind of a watch list of people that the police are looking out for. So we're definitely, NetPol do quite a lot of work around police surveillance. And one of the things I think we'll get on to talking about is the kind of landscape around police surveillance, which is quite rapidly expanding. So that was quite worrying. Trans rights campaigners and anti-fascists are pretty good at taking steps to protect their privacy. So we tend to really advise people to wear a face covering when attending protests, not just to protect their privacy, but also for health reasons. The pandemic is still happening. And luckily, a lot of the people that were attending were wearing face coverings. But what we saw from the Metropolitan Police was really high levels of violence. Activists were kind of beaten, were shoved. There was the use of pepper spray, which is quite similar to pepper spray, where people were being sprayed directly in the face and needing to receive first aid on site. So yeah, we've come out very strongly against the police violence. We absolutely condemn it. And we're working with some of the folks who were affected in the aftermath of that to kind of link them up with different kinds of support. But it is unfortunately the case that, especially in the current political climate around trans rights, this isn't the first time that we've seen quite high levels of police violence around trans rights protests. There was all the Honor Oak stuff last summer where anti-fascist and trans rights protesters were coming together to protect a drag queen story time event. And it is one of the times, I think, where the police really do show their true colours. in terms of who they think they're on the streets to protect and what actions they'll take to do so. One of the reports that we got from people on the ground that we were really worried about actually was campaigners noticing that a lot of police officers, including one officer in particular, they've sent us pictures of, who were policing the demonstration, were displaying thin blue line badges, which is an insignia that is associated with fascist and far-right white supremacist groups. So, we do kind of see that kind of culture of misogyny, like anti-trans attitudes and like far-right attitudes within the police kind of coming to the surface when they're approaching trans rights protests. Worrying stuff.
Yeah, it's I don't know, it always feels quite heavy-handed at trans rights protests, but then to have like an independent group like NetPol come in and say like, oh yeah, this is
on display while they're policing it. Yeah, they definitely they show who they are, eh?
Yeah. So in terms of being trans at a protest, what is the like NetPol advice around that?
So if folks are headed out onto the streets, there's a couple of bits of like one of our functions really is to provide know your rights information and to try and skill people up so they do feel confident heading out. And we do that in alliance with a couple of grassroots groups that we work really closely with. And one of the groups that I definitely shout out around this is Green and Black Cross, who've produced a fantastic resource called Being Trans and Protesting, that I'm sure we can link in the show notes, that is well worth a read. It's a really comprehensive PDF resource that kind of runs people through what their rights are. But I think in such a difficult climate where there's been so many news stories saying protest is becoming illegal, and you and I are having a conversation about really serious police violence on demonstrations, actually the last thing that we want to do is scare people off the streets. The government and the police are trying hard enough to do that. So we're all about empowering people to actually get out there and fight for their rights, because there's never been a more critical time to do this. So if people are headed out to join protests, there are 5 key messages that we usually tell people when they're headed out. I'll run through them very quickly now. Again, I'm sure we can link them, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the specifics around being trans and protesting, because obviously if you're stopped and searched or you're arrested, you will be treated differently. You might be treated differently than like cis protesters. So the 5 key messages we usually give people is no comment. You don't need to answer police questions, so don't help them with their surveillance. No personal details. You don't have to give your details under any stop and search power unless you're the driver of a vehicle. So again, don't help the police with their surveillance. And we did see stop and searches actually at the weekend, so I think that's a really important one for people to remember, especially because stop and search powers for protests are being expanded. If people are arrested on a demonstration, we advise them not to take a duty solicitor, but instead to contact a protest specialist solicitor. Hopefully you've got legal observers and other wonderful legal support volunteers on your protest who can support you, and they can give you the number of a good solicitor. It is free to receive legal representation at the police station. Sometimes people get put off because they think, I can't afford lawyer fees, but you are entitled to free representation at the police station. So we really advise people to get in contact with one of our recommended solicitors who can help you. And then the last 2 are we advise people not to accept a caution unless they've been given specific advice to by a good solicitor. Because a caution, if you're arrested, is kind of an easy win for the police, where they get you to admit guilt for an alleged offence that actually they might never have been able to bring that case to court. And the last thing that we advise people to do, and I think it's a really important one, is to actually challenge the police to act legally by asking them, if you're being given an instruction by the police, under what power? Because the police have to have a legal basis for their actions. And we find time and again that actually what the police are doing on the street is just asserting what they think they should be allowed to tell you to do. So, if people are being stopped by the police on a protest, or they're being given an instruction or told to do something, we'd always advise people, if you feel safe enough to do so, to ask questions like, do I have to do this? Am I being detained? Like, under what power? What's your legal basis for giving me this instruction? And often what that does is it can kind of let the police know that you understand a little bit about the law, and it's often a challenge to them, because we often find that police officers actually don't know the law that well. And I think with the new police powers being rolled out, a lot of police officers are very badly briefed about what they are and aren't allowed to do and what the limits of their powers are. So we always encourage people to kind of push back on that.
Cool. In terms of, I mean, I feel like we'll get to the new powers in a minute, but in terms of being trans with like stop and searches and like more invasive, not that being arrested isn't invasive, but those sort of more sensitive police procedures, what is like the specific advice on that?
Yeah, so this is a really key one. So obviously with rampant transphobia in our society and transphobia in our institutions like the police and the state, some people might not feel comfortable kind of putting themselves into that direct confrontation with police and state, and it can be risky. But at the same time, obviously, with all the attacks by the government on our rights, like more and more people on the streets than ever before. So if you are being stopped by the police, you're stopped and searched, you're detained, you're being arrested, there are some kind of special considerations for trans and non-binary folk, gender non-conforming folks that are coming into police contact. And people often have quite a lot of anxiety about that police contact. They're not sure whether to out themselves as trans to an officer. They might struggle to have their gender respected during a search or during an arrest process. But gender is a protected characteristic under the Equalities Act, so the police are supposed to, emphasis on supposed to, kind of respect your gender. And I think there's a couple of key things that hopefully will make people feel a bit more confident if they are in contact with the police. One is that you don't have to have if you've got documents like ID and stuff on you where maybe the name or gender or the photograph on your ID doesn't match well with the way that you're presenting, or you are in contact with the police and you're trying to be assertive about your gender and they're not respecting it, you should definitely try and get in contact with a good solicitor, because it might be that you could mount a case against the police after this happens. For stop and searches, if you're stopped by the police and you're searched, I'd kind of reiterate that basic advice of no personal details. You don't have to give details under any stop and search power. But for trans and non-binary folks, you might choose to tell the police your gender, because you have the right to request to be searched by an officer of the same gender as you. I'm non-binary. I don't think there are loads of non-binary police officers available to search me. So that is, yeah, well, so, you know, they're supposed to give you an officer of your preferred gender, the gender you've requested. If it's reasonably practical, that's what the law says. But if you're really uncomfortable going through a search process, you can kind of push on that and be assertive. There's kind of two levels of police search that people might be subject to. One is like a pat down search where they kind of touch your outer clothing, and an officer of any gender can search you for that. You can request someone of the same gender as you, but they don't have to provide it. That's probably the most common stop and search situation that people might find themselves in. If they want to do a slightly more invasive search where maybe they ask you to remove outer clothing, like a jacket, or they want you to take hats and scarves off, they'll usually take you to somewhere a little bit more private, like the back of a police van, so not very private, but out of public view. And that's where you've got a bit more sort of legal basis to request an officer of the same gender and to be assertive about that. So, although we say no personal details, that might be something that you do choose to disclose to the police. And likewise, during an arrest process, you're usually searched as part of an arrest. So that's also a time that people might choose to be a bit more assertive about that. Just a note on ID and documentation is we have had instances where people have been searched or arrested and the police don't think that the name and face on the ID that you're carrying matches well to you. And the police have then accused that person of stealing the bank card or the ID. So you might be accused of stealing your own property. These cases almost never make it to court because they are quite clearly stupid. But it is just something to be aware of. And if people are setting out to a protest, we generally advise people not to carry anything you don't need. So not taking ID, not taking driver's license, passport, thinking about whether you can travel without your bank card and just take cash with you, that kind of thing can kind of just simplify that a little bit. So something to think about if you're packing your bag to go on a protest.
That's wow. That's really desperate, or like, I mean, from one perspective desperate, from another perspective punitive of the police. But yeah, another aspect of what the police should know and should be doing. The new 2022 and 2023 laws have like changed the landscape of protesting quite a lot, and with new offences and new ways to nick people. How have, in the last, well, I guess since COVID, in the post-COVID period, how has like police violence and police tactics been different because of those new laws, perhaps compared to before?
Yeah, it's definitely an escalated situation. So obviously during COVID, the Police Crime Sentencing Courts Act, which sparked the Kill the Bill movement, kind of hit Parliament, and that was the first wave of big legislation that we saw the Tory party kind of trying to shove through in this culture war that they're fighting against what they would term quote unquote disruptive protest. We would probably term campaigns that work. So they've in the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, that it was like a huge bumper document with a ridiculous amount of things rolled into it. And it introduced new laws that allowed the police to do things like impose conditions on protests that were too noisy or might be deemed to cause persons in the vicinity to suffer serious unease, alarm or distress. So, you know, like quite vaguely worded, quite vaguely worded things. And it also introduced, it sort of expanded the police's powers to impose all sorts of conditions on a protest, where they can kind of say, you know, a condition of this protest is that you're not allowed to be in the road, you've got to be on the pavement, and we're issuing a Section 12 notice. So, you know, now this is kind of almost like a temporary law that just applies to this, and you can be arrested if you don't obey it. So that's something that we have seen used in quite a widespread way, where the police impose conditions on a protest, and then you can be arrested for breach of those conditions. Now, our advice for dealing with that situation, it wasn't the most headline-grabbing thing that was introduced in the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, but it is the one that we've seen the police use most often. Our advice for that, it echoes that of the London Transport organisations, where we say, don't see it, don't say it, sorted. Legally, the safest thing for you is not to know that there have been conditions imposed on the protest. So that's where we say to organisers, if you have conditions imposed on your protest, don't tweet it on social media, don't pass messages between the police and the crowd, don't hand out leaflets that the cops have given you, don't announce it on the megaphone, because actually legally you're putting people at more risk by doing so. Now, there was a bunch of other bits of law that changed. They reformed the law around public nuisance, which is quite an old law that was on the statute books, but they've kind of made it much more specific to protest. They introduced tougher new sentences for obstructing the public highway. They introduced a bunch of legislation to make a more controlled area around Parliament. And they also, at the last minute, tried to introduce a number of absolutely terrible and extremely repressive amendments, which all got thrown out of the original bill. But because the government have the power to bring things back, they repackaged most of those amendments up into what we now know as the Public Order Act and just pushed them through. So, you know, it's been a bit of a circus of a parliamentary process. And the Public Order Act was the second round of big legislation that came through. We do have explainers to all of this on the NetPol website. I know taking in legal information, it can be a bit techie. So we can definitely link to some further resources on this. But I guess the important thing to know about the Public Order Act and the Police Crime Sentencing Courts Act is that they took steps to criminalise common direct action tactics. It's part of this culture war where the Tories want to paint anyone involved in anti-racist movements like Black Lives Matter. They want to paint trans rights protesters. They want to paint environmental protesters as these people that are intrinsically opposed to this, the British values of democracy, and they're out to disrupt our communities and bring them to a standstill and and they're really intent on trying to separate us into good protesters and bad protesters. And the good protesters are the people that operate within this increasingly narrow window of what is considered legally acceptable and are not disruptive. And the bad protesters are the people that are blocking roads, are locking on, are tunneling, are bringing traffic to a standstill, are picketing, are doing these kind of what they would see as more disruptive actions. And the Public Order Act brought in a bunch of new criminal offences, like it criminalised locking on, the tactic of kind of attaching yourself to something. It's often arm tubes, or sometimes activists like chain themselves to things to block roads and block gates and that kind of thing. It criminalised the act of locking on itself. It brought in new laws around obstructing major transport works and key national infrastructure. It's expanded police stop and search powers, although these aren't yet in operation. It's taking a little while for some of these new laws to actually filter into police practice. So we're not seeing the widespread use of these yet, but we're expecting them. And another important thing that the Public Order Act brought in actually is something called serious disruption prevention orders, which are essentially, they're very draconian, they're very controversial. They're essentially anti-protest banning orders, where individuals named in one of these could be prevented from being in contact with particular people, from promoting causes on social media, from attending protests. They're very, very restrictive. And we haven't seen these used yet, but we're expecting to see the first editions of these kind of come in the next year or two. Just one last thing on this, and then I'll stop, because I know this has been a bit of a whistle-stop tour. If this all sounds really scary, it's definitely concerning. And something that we always tell people around these new laws is a lot of them build on existing police powers. So although the police do have new legal means at their disposal to target protest, a lot of this is actually nothing new. It's the Tories trying to grab headlines and look tough on protest the way that they've often wanted to look tough on crime. So we don't want people to be afraid that protest has suddenly become illegal. What we do want them to be is risk aware that it's become a more uncertain landscape, and the police are sometimes under direct political pressure from the Home Office to crack down on particular movements, and they make operational decisions based on that. So, we've seen them really crack down on the Palestine movement. We've seen incidents like Saturday where they really came for people standing up for trans lives. But there are ways to plan your action that keep you and your comrades safer. And there are a lot of organisations working where we can really support people when they're planning protests at every stage, before you do the protest, while you're on the protest. If there are arrests and court processes, we can work with you at every stage of that to try and keep you and your friends safer from state violence. So, the more people talk to us about what they're hoping to do, the more we can help and the more effective we can be as a movement.
How much, you talked about the ban on, the ban on organising, basically, for individual people. How much of the other measures that have come in have been legally tested in terms of prosecuting an offence and these things? How much of that is, where are the legal are the legal bounds of these new powers known?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and actually it's still up for grabs, because we're kind of seeing the first cases just start to go through now. It does take quite a while for things to go from Parliament into the hands of the police, and then from there for there to be the first arrests. And the court system is so backed up from COVID. It's taking quite a while for legal cases to come to trial. And we do, to be honest, we see a lot of charges dropped before it comes to trial. But we do know whenever the police get new powers, they're quite keen to test them out. And the Crown Prosecution Service will be keen to explore the boundaries of the powers in court. So I think, as I said, we haven't seen the widespread use of some of the new offences in the Public Order Act yet, but we have seen a couple of arrests for them, charges subsequently dropped. What we have seen is the continued widespread use of the powers that allow police to impose conditions on protests. But again, that's an expansion of powers they already had. And I think one of the things that is really important to get across is part of how the Tories and the government are trying to shut down the space for protest is through these headline grabbing legal interventions. So we saw recently the Tories making headlines by saying, we're going to ban face coverings at protests. You know, like covering your face at a protest for privacy and health reasons is a really key way that we advise people to keep themselves safer. But already we're getting questions from people saying, oh, you know, well, I'm not allowed to wear a face mask at a protest anymore. And actually, the government have laid no legislation around this yet. They've just made an announcement and it's been in the headlines. And people already think, oh, well, no, that's illegal, so I can't do it. So I think it's quite a clever tactic from them to shut down the space for dissent, even before they've actually legally tested some of these interventions. And things like serious disruption prevention orders are going to be so open to legal challenge. Because so much of this legislation is badly put together. It's been rushed through Parliament by a government that knows it might not withstand the next election. And, you know, I think a lot of it is really open to challenge, but it doesn't mean that it hasn't already scared people. And we really try and encourage people not to self-police, actually. That's part of the reason we do so much know your rights education work. It's because we don't want to do the police's job for them by like restricting ourselves already in our imaginations and the way that we move through the world. So, yeah, the police already have the powers to compel people to remove face coverings at protests. There's a police power called Section 66, Section 60 AA, where they can ask people on demonstrations to remove any face covering that they deem is primarily being worn to conceal their identity. And we've seen them use this on Palestine marches. So they already have a version of this power. They haven't even laid legislation, but they've just been able to put out that message. No, it's not acceptable to wear a face covering at a demonstration. And it does affect people's confidence and it does affect the police behaviour towards people.
And with the Section 60 AA, is that also a case of like, don't accept any pamphlets, don't look at the Met Police's Twitter if they're like alerting about it?
It's similar and a little bit different. So we've seen a couple of arrests for Section 60 AA breaches on some of the recent Palestine marches, but all of those cases have been dropped. So we definitely still advise people to mask. The police, it basically allows the, we'd always advise people not to pass on messages from the police. So we'd always say, don't do their job for them. They don't need our help. But with that one, it's if the police challenge you and ask you to remove a face covering, you can refuse. You should be aware there is a risk of arrest, and you should definitely try and document the process and get good legal support at the station. As I mentioned, not accepting the duty solicitor, going for one of our recommended solicitors, because you usually are able to fight that case. But you can refuse and leave the area. Legally, you're allowed to refuse and leave the area rather than comply with the instruction. But we just do. I think it's a tricky situation sometimes with policing, where what we saw in the case of those arrests on the Palestine march is actually the police had interpreted their powers as that they could just arrest people for wearing face coverings. And that was why the cases got dropped, because they don't have the power to do that. But this is what I meant when I said, we often see that the police actually don't understand what powers they have. And this is why a lot of these, this police repression is extremely open to legal challenge.
On those Palestine protests, like if those 2022 and 2023 laws the last couple of years, then in the last sort of 6 months, how have things changed with the pro-Palestinian movement? Because NetPol has a report that, if I procrastinate editing this interview enough, will be linked in the show notes. So how much can you say about that
Yeah,
and the change more
absolutely.
recently?
Yeah, I can share some headlines. So, we've been conducting a really big bit of research to look at the policing of the Palestine protests since last October 2023, and we'll be launching our report in May 2024, late May, possibly early June, depending how much we procrastinate with the editing. But our findings on it are quite concerning. I think the Palestine protests have obviously got some additional pressures on them, not just from the new police powers and this kind of very repressive atmosphere around disruptive protest, but because of institutional racism from the police and the government, and this kind of suppression of anything to do with Palestinian rights in the public eye. So we've seen some. One of the things that we really highlight in the report that we're working on is this climate of intense police surveillance and sometimes police harassment. And that's something that we're hearing reports from across the board from all protest movements that there's this very intense situation around police surveillance at the moment. We've seen the use of a lot of arrests for racially aggravated or racially motivated offences. So this is where the government have characterised any expression of Palestine solidarity as, we're all out on hate marches and it's intrinsically anti-Semitic. So a lot of people are facing quite nasty charges from that. There's been very confused and patchy policing around the use of particular slogans or chants or things written on placards. Police forces across the country can't seem to agree what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable, and people are often being hassled on demonstrations or might have their picture taken and later shared online if they've got particular slogans displayed. And we've definitely seen a lot of racist targeting of anyone who's displaying slogans that are written in Arabic. The police are sometimes using interpreters sort of on the ground and kind of detaining people while they try and deem whether your placard written in Arabic or, whatever you've got written is acceptable to them or not acceptable to them. But we've definitely seen some big mess ups around that. And we've definitely seen like a lot of racial profiling on demonstrations, people of Palestinian or Arabic heritage, like being particularly subject to police violence and arrest. So I think when our report comes out, we're really hoping to make it quite practical and useful for the movement. We want to talk about not just what the policing strategies to target us have been, but how we can resist them. Because I think NetPol as an organisation, as a police monitoring organisation, we're quite clear that whether it's this government or a Labour government, the people in power are not interested in rolling back police powers. So our best defence actually is community defence. It's to organise together. It's to understand the legal situation and how to move within it. And it's to stand together and kind of refuse to be separated into the good protesters and the bad protesters, the peaceful people and the disruptive people, and actually to kind of try and build this like intra-movement solidarity where we say we're not prepared to be divided in those ways.
Like, that's good, not just kind of dropping that the police are terrible and have all these powers, and then but having a way to kind of, as a community, move on from that sounds really good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, briefly touched on this earlier, but the last month the Home Office trailing their new powers with unmasking, like unmasking protesters and not allowing fireworks and flares at protests. Just in terms of like the direction of travel of British policing, is that actually an escalation or just messaging? And if in the likely case that a Labour government wins in the general election, do you think that kind of increasing rhetoric and increasing powers will continue?
Yeah, I have to say, I speaking personally, I don't have a lot of faith in the current Labour opposition.
No.
It's I don't know, I'm being polite about it. I guess this is definitely the direction of travel for British policing. While the laws around masking and the use of flares and fireworks, again, we've already got police powers and laws governing and restricting the wearing of face coverings and the use of fireworks and flares on demonstrations. It might be that they managed to get some new legislation through Parliament that increases their powers to crack down on this. But almost regardless of whether they do or not, it kind of sends a very clear political and operational message to the police that this is not acceptable behaviour and they should use the powers they've already got to crack down on people. So this is definitely where we would suggest that if people are organising, that they're thinking about policing and supporting each other from very early stages in their organising, that they're doing things like reaching out to Green and Black Cross to get legal observers to their demonstrations, that they're attending Know Your Rights briefings, that they're talking to NetPol, talking to Green and Black Cross about potential legal situations that they might face, and that they're organising practical support in the case of arrest. So they're thinking about how they would find out if people were arrested, what police station were they at? Are there going to be people there to meet them when they're released? Will there be people around to do court solidarity and go with people to court dates? Do they have the number of a good lawyer that they could call if they were arrested? And just thinking not just about the legal support that's needed, but the kind of practical and emotional support that's needed for each other in this atmosphere of increased police repression. Because as we saw with the Royal College of GPs protest at the weekend, it can really shake people up, and actually comradeship and the bonds of kind of friendship and solidarity that can hold us through those moments is what makes our movement strong. And while this kind of police and political repression is only escalating because we're winning. It's because our movements are strong. We're talking about the crackdown on the Palestine movement since last October, and that is happening, and it's real and it's scary. And it's in the context of this being one of the biggest upsurges of public support for Palestinian rights that we've seen in our lifetimes. That's why they're cracking down on us. It's because they're scared. So I think we're really trying to build people up to think about this, to plan for this, to be risk aware, but also really to stand by each other and kind of be prepared to fight our corner around this.
Yeah. Is there anything kind of you would want to put out to an audience in terms of, even if it's just repeating the KYR? And yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I can't say the 5 key messages enough, particularly no comment. I think one thing that it's important to be aware of, we've talked about the kind of increased landscape around police surveillance, but things like serious disruption prevention orders, although they are scary and they're worrying, they'll apply to very few people within the UK. We think at this stage we're not expecting to see the widespread application of them. But what will be needed from the police in order to make things like serious disruption preventions work legally, in order to build the case that they should be able to use one against someone in a protest movement, is they will need to carry out incredibly widespread surveillance on that entire movement in order to map those connections and find out who to target. So what I would kind of want to leave people with, I guess, is I'll do the 5 key messages in a moment, but really advising people to seek out resources around police surveillance for their organising, and to kind of see this anti-surveillance work as part of how we form a culture of care within our groups. Recognising that we're all people will have different vulnerabilities towards this kind of policing. So to go over the 5 key messages as well, and I'm sure we can link these in the show notes, just to hear them once again. It's no comment. You don't need to answer police questions, so don't. No personal details. You don't have to give your details under any stop and search power unless you're the driver of a vehicle. But again, with that caveat that for trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming folks, we might actually want to be assertive about our gender if we're being stopped and searched or arrested, so that we can be treated appropriately. Under what power? Always ask the police under what power and challenge them to act lawfully. And then in the case that someone was arrested, we'd advise them not to accept a duty solicitor, but to use one of NetPol's recommended solicitors who've got protest experience, and they will give you free support at the police station. You won't be charged for that. And if you are arrested, not to accept a caution unless you've been advised by a good solicitor to, because again, cautions are an easy win for the police, and they do go on your permanent record.
All right. Is there anything else that you would want to touch on in this? Because I've sort of run through.
Yeah, I think that's good. I've probably talked your ear off, so I've probably given you a bit of an editing job. But
that's all right.
I will send you links to the NetPol explainers on the Police Crime Sentencing Courts Act and the Public Order Act, just so people can kind of feel like they've got the resource that kind of rattles through the laws in a bit more detail. And I'll also send you a link to our 5 key messages, some of our resources around police surveillance, and the Being Trans and Protesting PDF guide, because I think that's a really good one.
Thank you to Kat and NetPol for their time and being on. Links to those guides and resources just mentioned are in the show notes. Our music is Mindbreak.018m by Free99. They can be found on Twitter, Bandcamp, Newgrounds, and Spotify. Stay safe. More reports to follow.